It is not about whether or not Zohran Mamdani is daddy. It is not about whether or not Zohran Mamdani is a revolutionary or a real socialist. It is not about whether or not some people are dumb on the internet because they like Zohran Mamdani or because they dislike Zohran Mamdani. My position is this. This is where the people are at. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has come under significant fire because of her position on a recent bill proposed by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a fascist, but is opportunistically using the populist sentiment against Israel's actions in order to rally that base to support her brand of fascism. We're seeing this more and more. As we touched on in our videos about MAGA regret, we're seeing more and more how the right wing, led by figures like Tucker Carlson, as well as the goofballs like Theo Vons of the world, are all kind of unanimously saying, hey, this is bad. Hey, this is a genocide, right? And we actually stand against this. And they're wiggling their way to talking about it being a deep state thing that is putting Trump's arms behind his back, tying them behind his back and forcing him to support things. But we know what the truth is, right? And a lot of it is just deeply embroiled in anti-Semitism because these are the right wingers, right? This is what they do. So they're opportunistically using that. But obviously, a popular surge of anti-imperialist thought, particularly anti-genocide, anti-Israeli genocide of Palestinians, has emerged globally, led by the left. And our representatives in the United States politically are very few in number because both parties in the United States are very much the parties of capital. And the parties of capital are going to represent capital's interests. And capital's interests are to continue doing colonialism, imperialism, as violently as necessary in order to secure more profit. This is all tied together. So AOC is a member of the Democratic Party. We know her. We love her, right? She has been branded this new face of the progressive left, this young voice. Her victory a couple of years ago against the establishment Democrat, was it Joe Crowley, who had significantly outmanned her in terms of money, was inspiring to many progressives around the United States. But it has been clear since she has risen to prominence and to power in the U.S. that sometimes she's just gonna sell out. That's just what she does. She's never really been a socialist. She's never really been a communist. She's always been more so a social democrat with a left-leaning agenda. She put a lot of weight behind the idea of a Green New Deal. But when it comes to the issue of Israel, she has been very spotty in her voting track record. And this recent vote against Marjorie Taylor Greene's bill to stop funding Israel and Israeli military represents one of the most bizarre and naked capitulations to capital possible. It's just bizarre. Everybody's drilling into her for it. She's receiving a lot of stick for it. As you may have seen, her office was vandalized after this recent vote, okay? AOC funds genocide in Gaza. And she's been very mad at leftists on Twitter. Because why not? You know, when you're in this position, what you should be doing is arguing with leftists on Twitter to back up why you decided to vote against the removal of funding for the Israeli military. So what she said was, Marjorie Taylor Greene's amendment does nothing to cut off offensive aid to Israel, nor end the flow of U.S. munitions being used in Gaza. Of course I voted against it. What it does do is cut off defensive Iron Dome capacities while allowing the actual bombs killing Palestinians to continue. I have long stated that I do not believe adding to the death count of innocent victims to this war is constructive to its end. That is a simple and clear difference of opinion that has long been established. I remain focused on cutting the flow of U.S. munitions that are being used to perpetuate the genocide in Gaza. And as you can see, people are very much not happy with this. And a lot of people have explained already why this is bad, okay? In a word, it doesn't make any sense to consider defense spending, defensive military capacities as something so separable from aggressive, offensive military capacities. It is because Israel has this Iron Dome, which we back, that Israel has impunity to terrorize its neighbors. Without its massive Iron Dome and all of this defense spending that it has to protect its civilians, it would have to protect its civilians by, not being a terrorist state. And that's how war works, okay? And Hassan outlined a lot of this in a stream recently. I catched a little bit of it. Would it make sense to say, we got to make sure we fund defense spending in Russia, right? We're not going to fund their military to attack other countries, but we'll fund their military in Russia, of course, to protect its civilians, and we'll do so in Gaza as well. Why don't we do those things, right? Why don't we fund Chinese defense spending of protecting its civilians? Why don't we do those things? Well, we consider them to be opposition. We consider them to be antagonistic, and we also don't necessarily see the need to spend our money on defending other countries, right? So it's all a sham. It's all ridiculous. There is no huge distinction between offensive and defensive military spending. But AOC, whether or not she is being genuine, which I kind of think she is, I kind of think that that's just how she actually is thinking about this, and it's just wrong. But whether or not this is coming from a place of her actual sincere position that she's really thought out, this fourth grader level understanding of war, fourth grader deeply entrenched in the U.S. education system, let's say, whether or not it's that or that she's getting paid off behind the scenes. Of course, she doesn't receive any AIPAC funding. We should probably do away with the myth that AIPAC is the sole reason that the U.S. and its politicians in particular back Israel. It's not. It's definitely one of the vessels through which it does that, but it's not that. It's the fact that the state itself and both parties and its capitalist class, the international capitalist class, wants colonialism. Colonialism is a vital part of capitalism, so they want colonialism. And these politicians, represent these political parties that are firmly entrenched in representing capital's interests. So maybe it's a cynical reason. Maybe she's getting paid off. Maybe it's that she just thinks this genuinely. But regardless, it's horrendous. It's horrendous, and other Democrats voted for this bill. It very much received very few votes. Ilhan Omar of the Democratic Party voted for this bill. She voted for don't give Israel any money for their military. So it's not even something that is like moving with the party line in some sort of deep necessary way. I mean, she represents New York, for God's sakes. A very left-wing district, the same one that Zohran Mamdani emerged from. Not the exact same district, but like overlap. So it's just bizarre. It's just horrible. And it's just another instance of AOC not being a socialist, not being a person with actual liberatory political views, but in fact being, an establishment Democrat with some progressive ideals. And you know what? That's AOC. But today I want to talk about Zohran Mamdani, because a lot of the conversation about Zohran Mamdani, the person who just won the Democratic mayoral primary in New York City, has been about whether or not he is the next AOC. And this is not helped by the fact that Mamdani, who received backing from, Bernie Sanders and AOC, that was crucial to his winning the Democratic primary for the mayoral race, had a recent meeting with Bernie Sanders in which Bernie Sanders urged Mamdani, according to CNN, to be cautious about how he approaches talking about Israel. Both are critics of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's handling of its war in Gaza. And ahead of the trip, Mamdani told business leaders in New York that he would discourage the use of the phrase globalize the Intifada. Mamdani, who has not used the phrase himself, has said he believes the phrase to be a rallying cry for Palestinian human rights and refused to condemn its use when asked during his primary campaign. And Sanders also emphasized that Mamdani had to do a better job explaining that his criticism is not anti-Semitic and to not let himself seem like he's minimizing the fears Jews in New York and elsewhere feel from the threat of hate against them. Okay? And they took a very happy selfie after that. So I made a post about this when this story came out. I will read you what I wrote very briefly, in case we needed more evidence of the Democratic Party being, as August Nims, that's a Lenin scholar, says, the black hole of progressive movements. If Zohran keeps inching closer to the establishment line on Palestine, that will bleed into other issues as well. And as soon as we see he makes tangible regressions on policy promises, he will alienate his base. He is still by far and away the preferential choice for mayor of New York City. My people long for free e-buses, lol. But this is what the Marxist-Leninists and Maoists have been telling us. There's only so much you can accomplish with electoral politics, and revolution is not among those things. And the less that Zohran delivers on the promise of his brand of socialism, the more that folks will be energized to go get it themselves by other means, okay? So that was my position. That was what I wrote about this. And I want to explain that, because a lot of people's reactions to that post, as well as to this stream, and general conversations about Zohran on, let's say, the far left or whatever they're calling it, have been to be utterly antagonistic to Zohran Mamdani and his supporters. And the message that they've taken away from what I wrote is essentially, yeah, you know what? Zohran Mamdani, he's just a careerist politician. He's just going to capitulate to the Zionists. He's just going to capitulate to business interests. He's the next AOC. You're all suckers for believing in this. I have a great deal of sympathy and also some intellectual intersection with that argument. I do. But I have a different takeaway and a different perspective on this, and some disagreement with that particular perspective on it, especially as it's articulated. So I think we need to understand the historical processes that are going on right now and stop centering our leftist conversations on who's an op and who's not an op, and are the people stupid or are the people good. I think we get bogged down in that a lot, and we don't realize that the essential question is not what do people think, are they right or wrong, but the essential question is, in fact, what do the people have as options right now? What are the people's options right now? What is in front of them? And right now, what Zohran Mamdani's campaign represents, and I'm not speaking about who Zohran Mamdani is as a person, because I don't know him, and I'm sure there's a great possibility he's an opportunist and a careerist. But what his campaign represented was a mobilization of popular will in the United States, particularly in New York City, of course, from young working class people to vote against, to politically act against the Zionist lobby, to politically act against the establishment of the Democratic Party, and to politically demand economic concessions, populist economic concessions to what the people need, to what the people are registering as a fundamental crisis of the economy, a fundamental crisis of living. The cost of living in New York City is absolutely absurd. That was what the vote was representing. When politicians are voted for, usually it is just a registering of a preference by people in terms of which slap in the face they would prefer between the Democrats or the Republicans. And generally, those of us who are left-leaning have chosen over the past decades the slightly less harsh slap in the face of the Democrats. What people have recognized more and more, both because the party has gotten worse, if that could be possible, but also because it's become clearer what the party actually is and has always been, what people are recognizing more and more is that there is no liberation possible through just registering that preference. This is not political action. This is not political will. We are not exercising political will through our votes in this country. Not as long as we are voting between a Democrat and a Republican who are both representing the same capital. And so what the people look at now is what they can do. And their political education has been so thoroughly steeped in voting as the only way to act politically. But more so than what they know and what they don't know, history is not moved by ideas. It is not moved purely by ideology. History is moved by material conditions. And what people are registering, what they're recognizing is Well, there's not really a revolutionary organization that I believe in right now. There is not some organization down the block that I can see feeding people and giving them red books. There is not a big vanguard party that is successfully mobilizing people. There's not a real chance that any type of violent reaction that we can cook up right now is going to be anything but squashed. That's not to say that certain, vigilante actions haven't had certain impacts, but people are registering very understandably, very rightly, that there's not really some sort of war that's about to break out in which the people can just take over the Capitol and win. That's not happening. That is what the people are recognizing. That's what they're trying to tell us. A central thought in Maoist thinking is that we are supposed to recognize what the people are telling us and respond to their needs. And I'm not a person who has an affiliation with a particular tendency. I just try to study and think about these things and then communicate my thoughts to you as well as the information I'm finding. But even among these tendencies from which a lot of y'all are speaking, there is still an importance in hearing the people out, recognizing what their material situation is, and recognizing that that is the place from which they are acting. That is the historical materialism we're talking about. So to look at the Zohran Mamdani campaign and purely see it as people just not being radical enough, or people just being naive, or people just being uninformed and thinking that they'll just change the world through voting for Democrats that are better than the current Democrats. For that to be your takeaway means that you're not quite processing the historicity of this moment. You're not quite thinking in terms of historical materialism. Again, this is just my standpoint. And I'm not one of these people that's going to browbeat leftists for their positions. I understand the frustration and I understand the talking point. And I think there's a need for people to agitate and say, hey, Zohran Mamdani is not going to save us. The Democrats are never going to save us. The Democratic Party is the black hole through which all of our sentiment is getting sucked in. But at the same time, I think it might be a better strategic choice to simply look at the fact that this is the conditions facing people right now and think about how to continue to move them into a direction where they organize more revolutionary action and where they have a more and more organized and educated understanding of establishment politics, rather than simply concur that they're naive. Conclude that they're naive. Heart Splinters says you can't say you don't have a tendency if you primarily mention and discuss ML and MLN discussion points. Like you have a clear bias, be honest with yourself. So this is the problem, right? Is that I also have an understanding and a good deal of respect for democratic socialists and what they're getting across. I even have some respect for what progressives like Ilhan Omar are trying to do. And some understanding of like, okay, that's what they've recognized is their position and how they can better the world. Like, do I see Ilhan Omar's politics as the end all be all? No. And I also have a great deal of respect and alignment with a lot of things that anarchists are saying. The reason why I'm talking about ML and MLM talking points is because this is the standpoint from which a lot of people are poo-pooing anybody who says anything positive about the Zohran Mamdani election. And what I'm trying to tell those people is like, I get what you're saying, but I think we need to assess whether or not this is a revolutionary situation and what are the historical conditions that is bringing people's positive energy and hope towards this, and where is this probably going to go, and what can we do in the meantime to continue to build something stronger. So my position first is that, and again, I'm going to speak in the terms of Leninism as well as I can. I'm not a Lenin scholar. And again, I don't see myself as having some sort of strong tendency one way or the other. But Lenin was obviously a very prodigious revolutionary and revolutionary thinker. And one of the things that he came up with, let's say, in terms of terminology, is the idea of a revolutionary situation. So a revolutionary situation, according to Lenin, and this is written in The Collapse of the Second International, has three major symptoms, okay? The first is when it is impossible for the ruling classes to maintain their rule without any change, where there is a crisis in one form or another among the upper classes, a crisis in the policy of the ruling class, leading to a fissure through which the discontent and indignation of the oppressed classes burst forth. For a revolution to take place, it is usually insufficient for the lower classes not to want to live in the old way. It is also necessary that the upper classes should be unable to live in the old way. So this is a clear first major symptom. It's not just that the people should recognize we can't do this anymore. The upper classes are also supposed to be like, we can't do this anymore. And when we look at our current situation, I want to ask you, are we in a revolutionary situation? You know, and you might not agree with Lenin's definition. So we can have this conversation on different terms. By this measurement, we're not, right? Just this alone, because the upper classes are still by and large registering that the old way is still basically fine and just needs to be tweaked, if anything, or that we should get into an even older way, right? And the lower classes are beginning to become more and more conscious of their situation and saying this system is untenable. But they're not even quite at that mass level of dissent. It's large, but it's not. There's still a lot of lower class people who are like, I'm kind of good with the way things are. The second thing that Lenin says makes up a revolutionary situation is when the suffering and wants of the oppressed classes have grown more acute than usual. This condition is being met. And so a lot of people are saying, hey, things are getting worse and worse. Where's the revolution, right? But this is just one of the conditions. And it's a condition that has been the case, honestly, for decades. It's getting worse and worse. The suffering and want of the oppressed classes is growing more acute than usual. That, I think, is true. And then the third symptom is when, as a consequence of the above causes, there is a considerable increase in the activity of the masses who uncomplainingly allow themselves to be robbed in peacetime, but in turbulent times are drawn both by all the circumstances of the crisis and by the upper classes themselves into independent historical action. So beyond just recognizing that this shit isn't working, there's an increase of the masses recognizing, hey, we are needing to educate ourselves. We are needing to educate ourselves and mobilize. And the upper classes, as well as the circumstances of the crisis, are also encouraging the oppressed classes to do this. And I'll just say, his next line, which is, without these objective changes, which are independent of the will, not only of individual groups and parties, but even of individual classes. Okay, so even if an entire class wills that this is the case, this is independent of that. Lenin says a revolution, as a general rule, is impossible without these objective changes. So with that being said, do you think we are in a revolutionary situation right now? And I'm not a great French Revolution scholar, but it's something I'm studying currently, trying to understand better. During the French Revolution, it had been decades of untenable systemic problems within the French monarchy. A massive amount of debt and borrowing, and a massive inefficiency at properly gathering taxes and also properly building a capitalist class, right? During the French Revolution, which was a multiple year process, there were several different points where the ruling classes had an opportunity to say, let's give these people what they need. They weren't initially speaking to the lower classes, right? It was upper and middle classes, upper classes of nobles that were telling the monarchy, this isn't working. And only a small class that comprised the ruling class of arch conservatives were the ones that were continuously pushing back these moments, pushing back the potential for these reforms. And there was a lack of preparation and understanding from the ruling classes that, oh shit, if we don't start giving these upper and upper middle classes these reforms that they want to handle the economic situation that we're in, as well as the geopolitical situation that we're in, because France was under significant pressure from the rest of Europe. It was kind of an ominous situation, more so than an outright antagonistic situation, kind of like a Cold War-ish kind of thing. Europeans are always fighting each other, right? Without, their lack of being prepared for that made it so that the situation got more and more out of hand for them. It was several instances in which Louis the 16th could have met these upper middle classes and said, okay, you're right. The economy is not very fair for y'all. We're under a ton of debt. We're going to restructure and we're going to get this in play. And each time he failed to do that. And so what happened was that these upper and upper middle classes became so enraged and so determined to change this in spite of what the ruling classes were doing that they turned towards the working classes, the underclasses, and said, guys, y'all are getting screwed, right? We're getting screwed too. We need to change the system. And that is how the, let's say, historically controversial role of the masses during the French Revolution came into play. It was because the upper classes called them into play. Not the ruling class, but the upper classes underneath the ruling class became so disdainful of the situation. Once the working classes, the underclasses, the masses were energized and mobilized by the upper classes, movements started happening very quickly because people were out in the street rioting. The upper classes were conspiring to help give them weapons. And what happens is that afterward, there became a point where there was a difference in terms of what was desired by the upper and upper middle classes and what was desired by the working classes, the underclasses. And that is where there became the historically controversial devolution, let's say, but really just evolution, change, and violent change that we know the French Revolution to have encompassed today. Because all of these folks who wanted change and wanted to be in a better position in their upper middle class positions could turn to the working classes who were extremely energized and aggressive in Paris and say, I am your representative, and actually these guys are the sellouts. And then other upper middle class people, other potential, people who wanted reforms were like, no, I'm actually of the people. And they started performing that to the masses, and the masses were like, yes. And then there came a point where that upper class and upper middle class was like, okay, we've got this new constitution in place. We've got some reforms underway. Now it's time that we kind of settle this thing down. And because they did not properly assess the wars that were about to take place, that were beginning to take place with France and the rest of Europe, because they were too advantageous of those wars, and because they were not properly prepared to handle how the masses were going to respond to some of their needs not being met, because they were not able to communicate with the masses well, things sort of got out of hand for them. And it became this situation in which there was continuous violence by these progressives who shifted in terms of their allegiances to try to be more and more far left, let's say. This is the beginning of what we consider the left, so it's kind of funny to use that terminology. Okay? So this is what Lenin is talking about, I think, when he talks about a revolutionary situation. The upper classes, and so who are the upper classes in the United States right now? I'm talking about some business owners, but that are not billionaires. Like, people who are not billionaires are in this situation where they're like, we're getting a little bit pushed by this situation. We don't necessarily see a lot of potential for growth in the United States. The billionaires are seizing more and more of this land and of the landscape. You know, there are oppositions, there are fundamental contradictions between capitalists, especially between big capitalists and small capitalists. So the small capitalists are the ones who are becoming a bit more agitated and who are starting to see, you know, hey, I can kind of align with the people and the people's powers, the people's, you know, situation. But they're still very much not there yet. Okay? Like, there's a billionaire who funds the PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, as well as their outlet Breakthrough News, which you might have seen on YouTube. He's a small B billionaire. He's a smaller capitalist who is based in Shanghai, but he's American. And he describes himself as a Maoist. He represents somebody who is trying to be that revolutionary upper class, who is trying to say, well, it's me that's going to see the people and their desires and say, I'm going to bring them forth so that I can get the reforms that would help me and people in my position. And maybe, you know, this is not a moral thing. This is just talking about him as a class actor, right? Maybe he also really, really cares about poor people. But this guy exists. And similar things can be said of the DSA. Similar things can be said of a lot of us, right? I haven't gotten any money from any billionaires yet. I'll let you know when that happens. But so that condition is not being met. Nor are the conditions of the underclasses being completely radicalized or completely despondent with their situation. Nor is there a situation where the underclasses are politically educating and mobilizing themselves at a mass scale. It doesn't have to be everybody in the country, but I don't think there's even a single major city or major state in the United States, or state in the United States, for one, where a majority of the working classes are like, we don't fuck with any of this. It's very debatable. The underclasses are very unengaged politically, because that's where they're at. They're not at that point yet where they're like, hey, let's read some book. Like this group over here is bringing me in, and I think that they can help me, right? And if you want to bring those people into the fold, what are their concerns, right? Something that is talked about in this book that I talk about all the time on this channel, The Exhausted of the Earth. Something that's talked about in this book by Ajay Singh Chaudhary is that in order to mobilize people, there has to be a component of meeting their needs. There has to be care work. So the Muslim Brotherhood gained significant political power in the Arab Spring. Why? Was it because a billionaire showed up and gave them a bunch of money and guns and they ran in and took everything? Not quite. The Muslim Brotherhood, over decades, became a staple of many neighborhoods throughout the Muslim world in the Middle East for providing cheap or no-cost services to people, like fixing their bikes. So they became a neighborhood institution like that, not unlike what we talk about with the Black Panthers, right? One of the reasons the Black Panthers rose to such prominence is because they had a free breakfast program, right? They had free healthcare programs, right? And so when you look at what's going on, do you see an organization in the United States that's like, hey, we're a Marxist-Leninist, or we're an anarchist organization, we're a major leftist organization, and we provide free meals and also education? Because that was the thing. We're going to give you free meals, free tutoring, we're going to bring you in, and also we're going to teach you our ideology. That's how you bring these folks in. But we're not seeing that in the United States, right? In Brazil, okay, this is my last real world example before I get to sort of rounding out my arguments about Zohran Mamdani. Brazil is led by the Workers' Party, a party called the Workers' Party, and Luiz Inácio da Silva, Lula, who is a center-left politician. It also features an organization that is praised by leftists around the world, which is the Landless Workers Movement, that is continuously like the bane of all capitalist existence. They are a revolutionary socialist ideological party. They are, studied in Marxist-Leninism. But they don't just talk to people, right? They have a system of creating encampments and possessing land, right? Forcibly possessing land, dispossessing capitalists of land, using the justification of a particular law in Brazil. And they have always been strategic about their role with the state, with the center left. They've been strategic about their role with Lula, because Lula, for as much as he talks the talk about being a workers' party and being the representative of the people of Brazil, all the people of Brazil, and as much as he has accomplished certain significant reforms in Brazil, especially over the course of his entire political career, to where social programs were built, etc., the landless workers movement is continuously critical of Lula, continuously holding Lula accountable, holding his feet to the fire for when he is or isn't actually bringing forth the agrarian reform that he says he will. So this is brand new. Okay, this came out yesterday. The MST, the landless workers movement in Brazil, denounces the paralysis of the agrarian reform of Lula and demands effective commitment from the government. It's demanding that Lula da Silva fulfill his historic commitments to structural policies for the countryside. Essentially, Lula da Silva is talking the talk about building these strong structural plans. This is a strong agrarian reform for people in the countryside, but he's not doing that much about it to back it up. Okay? At the same time, the landless workers party, the landless workers movement in Brazil, was a key factor in disempowering the neo-fascist president that preceded Lula da Silva, and not only preceded Lula da Silva, but threw him in jail. Okay, Jair Bolsonaro. They were steadily opposed to Jair Bolsonaro, and they were critically supportive of Lula da Silva returning to power. Why? Because they recognize that neo-fascism is far more antagonistic than the already antagonistic bourgeois classes and the center-left Workers' Party. And they recognize that with Bolsonaro in power, there is more danger for them. Their movement has been, during the time period of Bolsonaro's presidency, they were more cautious about the direct action that they did. They were more focused on radicalizing the urban populations and the bourgeois populations, not necessarily to become outright communists, but appealing to them, showing them, especially during COVID-19, the pandemic, that they can help feed people through the land that they're possessing, right? That they are actually representing the needs of the workers, and that they're chill, essentially. That they have a cool hat that you should wear at parties. And that's a real thing, okay? One day we'll have a full deep dive into this. But why am I bringing this up? In the United States right now, there is no center-left party. There is no Workers' Party. The Democratic Party has a choice. It can either be that Workers' Party by submitting to the DSA takeover, essentially, of the Democratic Party, which is still at an early stage, but is represented by the success of Zohran Mamdani's campaign. Or they can continue to usurp that interest, continue to mold their most progressive politicians to fall in line, and root out anybody who doesn't, back the very center-right, very right-wing positions of the Democratic Party. And so one of two things has to happen. It's either going to be that they give that up, right? Or a new party will be formed. And Zohran Mamdani's position, if this was me, if I was working with Zohran Mamdani, what I would be thinking is this. Either we're getting shit done, delivering on our promises to New York City, winning that election, delivering on the promises that democratic socialism, that the DSA can provide to people, and giving, more and more significant social reforms that help more and more of the poor working classes, as well as continuing to have staunch opposition to the genocide of Palestinians. Or we go and we pivot out. Because if this Democratic Party is just going to keep fucking with us, we've already built so much people power, we can potentially convert that outside of it. What's actually happening? Well, Bernie Sanders had that conversation with Zohran Mamdani that I mentioned earlier. Zohran Mamdani told business leaders in a meeting that he's going to discourage the term globalize the intifada. And a lot of people are looking at this and saying, this is it. This is Zohran Mamdani selling out. This is exactly what we're telling you. This is none of these politicians are going to help us. None of these politicians are actually progressives, right? The thing is, this thing he's doing when he's saying he's not going to use the phrase globalize the intifada and he's going to discourage the usage of that phrase is not really a big capitulation from what his actual position was. He's never said he would personally use the phrase. He has said he won't police people from using that phrase because to many people it represents a rallying cry of the pro-Palestinian movement. And what's changing is that after Bernie Sanders gave him that call, he's like, okay, I will be a little bit more cautious and firm about not myself supporting the term. But I'm still not going to back down on my position that ultimately people have the right to say it. That's why he's not condemning globalize the intifada, right? And this was a discussion we had at the end of June, okay? This is not new. He declined to condemn the term globalize the intifada. He said, that's not the language that I use. And he said, the language that I use and the language that I will continue to use to lead the city is that which speaks clearly to my intent, which is an intent grounded in a belief in universal human rights. Right? He's not rejecting the phrase, but he is saying we do have to be careful about anti-Semitism and the bigotry that can emerge that might be aligned with that phrase in some cases. Do I like this position that Zohran Mamdani has taken? No. Is it my position? No. Do I also take the position that a lot of people in the DSA take where they're like, this is just him doing politics, right? Some people take this position. A lot of people in the DSA criticize them. The DSA is multi-tendency, right? But a lot of people are like, he's doing 3D chess. This is what's realistic. This is what actually works. You guys are just trying to not win ever. You don't ever want to win. You don't ever want to win. He's just doing a small thing. It's not. No, this is something people should criticize, right? You know, I'm not going to pull it up because we're running low on time, but I saw somebody articulate this pretty well on Twitter. He was very, very smart about how he addressed this dilemma or whatever during the first mayoral debate when he said, in response to, will you visit Israel? Where will you go when you become mayor? And is it Israel? Why isn't it Israel? He said, I am going to be in New York City because I'm going to be the mayor of New York City. And I want to represent New York City people.
I would stay in New York City. My plans are to address New Yorkers across the 5 boroughs and focus on that.
Mr. Mamdani, can I just jump in? Would you visit Israel as mayor?
I will be doing, as the mayor, I'll be standing up for Jewish New Yorkers, and I'll be meeting them wherever they are across the 5 boroughs, whether that's in their synagogues and temples or at their homes or at the subway platform, because ultimately we need to focus on delivering on their concerns.
Including Jewish New Yorkers. Right? That was good rhetoric. Don't concede to them. Don't concede to this idea that like, oh, well, there is anti-Semitism sometimes. And so we should be careful. We shouldn't try to. That's not good politics. Okay? Because why? Because they're not actually going to listen to you. None of these right-wingers in the Republican and Democratic Party, including Hakeem Jeffries, the House leader, are going to be like, well, that was a nuanced position, Zohran Mamdani. That was a very nuanced position. So, like, now that you've said that, now that you've shifted a little bit to saying discourage instead of just saying that you won't use it yourself, I choose to back you. And now you can make all these gains, right? None of that is going to happen. These people are not your friends. These people are not going to make this work. So it's bad politics because you already have a built-in understanding of how to respond to these things. If somebody asks you, will you discourage the usage of the term globalize the intifada, or what do you think of it, or do you use the term? You say, doesn't matter what term I use, I protect New Yorkers' rights of free speech, and I defend the rights of anybody protesting against genocide, which is what this is. We represent human rights, we represent equality, and if New Yorkers want to fight for equality and human rights, then that's what they should do. And yes, any Jewish folks are part of that coalition. I represent Jewish populations of New York City just as I represent all the other ones. Instead, he's starting to crawl back a little bit, and it's still bad. It's not the same thing as what AOC did. It's not the same thing as saying, well, actually, we should fund Israel, but like just the defensive parts, right? He's not saying, well, Israel is fine as it is, right? He's not saying it's not a genocide, right? Like he's still holding the same positions that he held before. And so to call this him selling out is not quite accurate. And moreover, to say this is a sign that he's the exact same as AOC is a little bit anti-intellectual. It's a little bit anti-intellectual, okay? I understand that they're both working through the Democratic Party as progressives, and that means that there's a lot that they can't do, nor are they representatives of any revolution. I can even concede to you that they're not real socialists. How about that? You want to say Zohran Mamdani is not a real socialist? That's fine. Sure. I don't disagree with you, because his position, his policies are not like socialist policies, but he has a particular move that he's doing. His move is, I think we can move, and this is me taking what he said and the way this works historically as an example. His position is, I think we can do socialism by building the Democratic Socialists of America, trying our best to work through the Democratic Party, and trying to oust all of the right-wingers from the Democratic Party and shifting it back to, if it ever was, a center-left party. And through that, pushing more and more people from throughout the United States to push more and more left-wing policies. I'll start off as a social democrat, and then if this cooks, then maybe I move more and more into the direction of more and more socialist policies. Do I think this will work? I don't know. I don't think so, but I'm not positive. But what's more important, again, I'm emphasizing to you, is why this is happening. It's happening because this is not a revolutionary situation. Lenin would not consider this a revolutionary situation. IMO, in my opinion. It's happening because we're still at a point where people are not really that educated or mobilized against their political situation, both in the working classes and in the upper classes. We're getting there. I will say we are getting there. I don't know when it's coming, but this has always been part of the historical process. In Russia, it was the same thing. Social Democrats emerged, and they were like, hey guys, you've been sitting on your hands as the ruling classes for decades, and this situation is getting out of control. We are here to say there's a way to avoid this turning into a violent revolution. We're going to build up this movement of people who are going to try not to fight, try not to die in a battle, and say, let's try to vote for this because you're giving us that option, right? This is the options that they have in front of us, in front of them today. And historically, what happens is that the ruling classes go, no, never. Not a social democrat, not a democratic republican, nothing. Just capitalism. Just the current ruling class, nothing more. Stomp it all out. And so the more that they do that, the worse and worse it gets. And by the worse and worse it gets, I mean the more and more the situation becomes revolutionary. Do we understand what I'm saying here? I'm saying that the important thing is to start thinking of us as historical actors, part of a historical process. It is not about whether or not Zohran Mamdani is daddy. It is not about whether or not Zohran Mamdani is a revolutionary or a real socialist. It is not about whether or not some people are dumb on the internet because they like Zohran Mamdani or because they dislike Zohran Mamdani. My position is this. This is where the people are at. And so we need to think about how we are going to meet the situation at present. And in my opinion, a lot of this happens because, frankly, a lot of the revolutionary socialists are not out here doing that much. Maybe it's because they're operating from a real sense of like, what is not happening? What is not going to work? That would be what I would say. Like, of course, there's not a current Black Panther Party. There was a reason the last Black Panther Party got rooted out. Okay? Of course, in this massive surveillance state, wherein violence is the norm, and that is becoming increasingly the case to any degree of political speech, Of course, people are not exactly thrilled at the prospect of taking up arms. And of course, even projects similar to what a Muslim Brotherhood was in the Middle East, and similar to what the Black Panthers were in the US, and similar to what, in a lot of cases, the landless workers movement in Brazil is right now, that party doesn't exist. There's real reasons that that party doesn't exist in the US, but it doesn't exist in the US. And so people are doing their best. Do you understand what I mean? People are organizing their workplaces and building orgs outside your electoral hellscape. This is not my electoral hellscape, my guy. I am not the guy who does this. I'm not the guy who created this. And by the way, you're right. Absolutely, you're right. Unionizing is extremely important in all of this, and unions are achieving significant gains across the United States. The concept of unionization has become more and more popular. But do you know why unionizing is becoming more and more prodigious across the United States? Why people are turning more and more toward interest in organizing labor? You're not going to like what my response is. It isn't because everybody just decided that socialism was good. It's because they saw that Bernie Sanders was running in 2016 and they were like, oh, this sounds good. And that helped them get educated. Through the election, they educated themselves a little bit more. Not to the point where they were radical or where they were super revolutionary. A lot of those Bernie bros were absolutely not. A lot of them still aren't. But it's the fact that among the upper classes, there was an attempt in 2016. And we all know what happened in 2016 and in 2020. And so because Bernie Sanders got all of that attention through the election, and then also got the kibosh, people were like, well, fuck this. I want to do something. And they started learning about unionization. That was a huge part of this. It is based on the failures that occur in a historical situation that more revolutionary action emerges. That is what I am saying. I'm trying to give you all a historical analysis. Okay? And frankly, yeah, like as the stories we tell is talking about in the chat, a lot of us don't have a great leg to stand on because a lot of us were libs before. And what were the conditions that made us more radical? For me, it was a great deal of things, starting with economic crisis, drone strikes by Obama, failures, quote unquote failures, but actually just successes by the ruling class of the Obama administration, seeing poverty increase, economic inequality increase, seeing racism, right? Seeing the Black Lives Matter movements, not movements, learning about Palestine, right? All that stuff was a process because I kept looking to the system to give me a crumb, and the system kept giving me shit. And a lot of you are not thinking historically. You're not thinking in terms of history. You're not thinking what your situation is. You're only thinking about who's right and who's wrong, who's good and who's bad. You're only thinking about whether or not this guy is socialist enough, or whether or not this guy is too socialist or whatever. All you're thinking about is arguing with leftists online. You're not thinking about, hey, why is this happening? Why do things happen? Why do things happen? Well, if you want to understand why things happen, and then figure out what your position is to make those things happen as best as they can, let's say, you got to study history. Yeah. So whatever the outcome of Zohran and other DSA campaign is, we as leftists have to continue to educate and agitate people in order for their needs to be met, which we recognize as, unfortunately, most likely necessitating a revolution. Opting to scold people over seeing hope or genuinely inspiring developments in the Zohran campaign, because, it represented something, the Zohran campaign, the ways people organized to vote against big money and the Zionist lobby, namely, is, to me, seeming like a strategic error with regards to educating and mobilizing people towards socialism. Try to be advantageous of the situation instead of critiquing it. History tells us revolutionary situations emerge after rounds of reformist movements fail, after said movements appeal to the increasingly radicalizing and aggressive public. And my last point, if there is no strong organized Marxist-Leninist alternative or other radical communist alternative in front of them, the people will have no choice but to put their hopes on democratic socialism. And I think that that's what's next. You know, just to make a lot of y'all happy, I do think that this is probably going to fail. There's a good chance Zohran is going to capitulate too much or fail too much. There's a good chance a lot of this DSA stuff is going to get stomped out or just fall flat. But that kind of needs to happen, because right now it's the only option people have in front of them. There's not really any other good options. But as that option continues to get through the process of happening, people will more and more start to learn about other things that they can do. And that, through that, revolutionary movements will emerge. Or the DSA magically was correct the whole time, and Zohran actually becomes the mayor of New York City, and then starts off as a social democrat and is like, yeah, this just shit worked super hard, and becomes a socialist mayor. And then all the rest of the United States starts voting for socialists, despite the hard fights of the establishment Democrats and Republicans in other cities and states. And so the DSA builds a huge amount of power, and then the capitalist classes are like, you know what? We gotta just do reforms. We're not gonna fuck up like previous ruling classes in history. We're just gonna do reforms like we did in 1945, and then within 50, 60 years, we'll just have had them all rolled back again, and then people will do this again. Maybe that's what's gonna happen. Or maybe they don't even do the latter part. Maybe we just get socialism through voting. I don't know. I am not the future predictor, but what I can tell you is the most likely thing to happen is that a lot of this is going to fail, but where it succeeds, it will engender more and more people to become more and more radicalized. And the situation, as it becomes more and more untenable, will become more and more revolutionary. No, it's not about scolding people. It's about being realistic and actually having strategy, not believing in a messiah. So, have you listened to anything that I've said? I just want to know, like, have you listened to anything that I've said? Because I literally told you that he's not a revolutionary and he's not a socialist. I'm literally giving you a historical materialist analysis of this based off of Leninist work. You can critique my analysis of Leninist work if that's what you'd like to do, because I'm no expert. You might give that to me. But don't start giving me straw mans about things that I did not say. But see, this is the problem, because you guys think you study historical materialism, you study Lenin, but then you don't read what he's saying to you. He literally is telling you what a revolutionary situation is. And when those conditions of a revolutionary situation are not met, a revolution is impossible. He's literally telling you that. I'm giving you historical analysis of what's happening in other parts of the world. Like, I'm giving you analysis of how these things work together. I am literally not saying he's a socialist, materialist, revolutionary comrade who's gonna radicalize the whole U.S. I literally don't think that's going to happen. But I see that things are changing because that's how history works. And like I've read, look, so I'm not here to dunk on other content creators or other like leftists. I'm gonna wrap up in like 10 minutes, I think. Maybe sooner. I'm not here to just dunk on people. I have no problem with any other leftist content creator as far as you guys know right now. I don't have anything to say to them. There's a lot of content creators who, yeah, I'll have disagreements with them. I watched some clips from Hassan. I have disagreements with Hassan. I have agreements with Hassan. I watch a lot of other people. You know, I have friends who are leftists who have tendencies that I'm not wholly in favor of. So I'm not here to beef. What I'm here to do is give a perspective shift. That's what I'm trying to do. But I get Elliot's point. The SOSDEM phase is inevitable in U.S. politics. That doesn't mean MLs have to blindly support Mamdani. Socialism for All is recommending going into DSA to build a network of support. And by the way, Maoists are doing this. Did y'all not see a while back that, you remember when there was that embassy shooting and that Maoist contingent of the DSA was like, we think this is good. We like this, right? And the DSA put out this statement that was like, this does not represent what we actually think. We do not support vigilantism at all, That they're doing that. So I have no beef with like people of these different tendencies. It's just that a lot of y'all are just like online and just trying to get into fights, right? Like that's what you're doing. Like even people like Marxist Leninists in real life, Maoists in real life, they are like, you know what, we're going to go into the DSA. We're going to try to see what we can do in the DSA, and we're going to build a network of Marxist Leninists in there. There's a lot of people doing a lot of things. People are trying their best. This is what I'm trying to tell you. So the best thing that we can do is analyze, okay, why are certain things not happening right now? Okay? And there is a deep need for us to do this because I laugh and I smile, but these issues are not funny. This stuff isn't funny. It's bad. The Palestinian Holocaust is happening. There's deep need for change. And I think, like, if there was a way that I could figure out how to just, like, make it all change tomorrow, I would try to do it. I think what I'm good at is, like, reading and talking and sharing with people as a journalist and an educator and an agitator. I think that's what I can do. And I do that by learning as much about history as possible. And this is what I'm telling you. This is a moment. That moment will change. What you have to recognize is what you can do to capture a moment, to seize on the opportunities created by a moment instead of toil over the difficulties or the impossibilities of a moment. See where the opportunities are. Learn from history. Learn not only from Lenin himself, but from the histories that Lenin was learning from. Learn from what anarchists have done, in the revolution in Puerto Rico, which was stymied by reformism. Like, learn, because then you get here and you go, oh, I remember, so this happened in France. And what happened was XYZ afterwards. So maybe if I can figure out how to bring more and more people into a point of being, like, educated about XYZ, or maybe if I can build up more material aid in an organization, like help to mobilize that, because I don't really want to talk. I just want to drive around and give people food. Maybe if I can do that for a more revolutionary organization or within the DSA as part of a revolutionary tendency, that can build, right? Humans make their history, but they do not do so as they please. And I think the problem for a lot of this analysis of what Zohran is or isn't is based purely on displeasure with the historical moment instead of analyzing how to make something of it. That said, there is an argument that the best way to capitalize on this historical moment is to make fun of Zohran supporters and to make fun of the DSA and to say that these people all suck, right? Maybe that is the best. Like, you figured that through the historical analysis that you've done, that that's the best thing to do. Maybe that is true. I don't know. But that's what I'm trying to tell you. Yeah, you have to study revolution in the global south, right? Because, like, people are, and Heart Splinters, much love to you. I know you were kind of like, hey, you're only talking about Marxist-Leninism and Maoism, but you're saying you're not any tendency. What's up with that? The reason I say that is because if you learn about revolutions in the global south, it's like, they didn't really have a one tendency that they just stuck to aggressively. They created their own tendency because what they were trying to do was not be dogmatic. What they were trying to do was meet their moment. So, like, the Zapatistas, okay, in Mexico, in Chiapas, they often get lumped in as anarchists, right? But they will tell you they're not anarchists. They do Zapatismo. There are things that they learn from Marxist-Leninism and from anarchism and from what's in front of them. But they're not strictly just saying, hey, it has to happen like this. And they're not just sitting around and going, well, you guys are wrong, because, like, they're literally just like, how do we build a counter state? How do we build our own state that is not subsumed by capital? And they've done it. And there's a reason why nobody tells you about this shit in US media, right? And whenever you hear about socialist projects, you only hear about their failures briefly in US media, and not even actually substantively. You only hear about like there's poverty there, so therefore, right? There were things that were achieved in the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela. There were also failings. There was also a massive collaboration with the capitalist class in Venezuela, right? But these things happen. Why? Because life is not just a certain philosophy bearing itself out over and over again. Life is constant reaction and action. So that's every approach that has ever been successful at anything. Like, I watch sports. This is the case in sports. It's not because of one dogma or one dogmatic approach. It's because there is multi-tendency. There is an observation of the opportunities available, and then there are choices made based off of that. So that's my gigantic rant about Zohran Mamdani, and I hope you enjoyed it. Really, it wasn't about Zohran Mamdani at all. It was about trying to have a historical analysis. And I'll just say, I don't want this to be a dunk fest in the comment section. I don't want this to be a way that everybody goes, hey, this content creator is a dickhead because he's just shitting on Zohran Mamdani, or this commentator is actually a dickhead because he's too positive about Zohran Mamdani. I don't want that. Okay? You can do that on somebody else's time and somebody else's comment section. It's not what I aim for here. All I'm aiming for is to tell you, hey guys, I learned a couple of things about history. This is what it looks like to me. Isn't that interesting? What do you think we should do? That's my project. So there you go. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.